Hey guys, this is Anti-Communist TV featuring Luis Marrero and rocking MrE, and I'm going to make a response video to SocialDemocrat01 on his video called Capitalism and Fascism, and I'm here about to debunk all his erroneous claims. Your theory literally holds no water. Yes, capitalism is so evil and fascist-like. The system that gave you YouTube, Facebook, a computer, a phone, etc., so you could criticize the capitalist system makes me laugh that you actually consider this to be fascist. And of course, every state in the world regulates and controls the aspects of the economy, but what you failed to mention is that this state controls and interventionism into the economy is not equal in every nation. The nations in which the state intervenes and controls the least, where individuals like you and me have the most basic freedom in terms of private property rights, trade, to invest, etc., basically have high levels of economic freedom. They also happen to be the most well-developed nations in terms of human development and high standard of living. On the other hand, nations where the state intervenes the most, where we have more state control and individuals restricted by state, we see an opposite trend appear. These nations actually suffer in terms of human development, economically, and standard of living. I absolutely love your retard logic. An individual owning the title to the means of production does not automatically make them a capitalist, especially if not talking about the free market capitalist system. Private ownership of the means of production is one of the characteristics of the capitalist system. You clearly do not understand economics. Again, slave labor only happens under fascism, corporatism, communism, as evidenced by history. A private business cannot employ people against their will without power of the state to force people by law and under a threat of aggression to work and perform labor. Again, this is an example of how business in bed with the government, as I clearly stated in my response video to Red Scare TV, so stop confusing corporatism to capitalism. They're not even close. Another logical fallacy I would like to point out in your video is the fact when I mentioned that Hitler violated private property rights for Jews, Slavs, and Gypsies, and you said it was on rational grounds, not on socialist grounds. Okay, and denying private property rights has never been a part of the aspect of the capitalist system. It doesn't matter what the motives were, but the actions that they took. Just because they made it for racial reasons does not mean anything. The motives do not change the fact that he didn't violate private property rights. It doesn't make it any less socialist. You do realize there are differences between the national and international varieties of socialism. Despite the difference, what remains synonymous between both of these totalitarian, oppressive, and socialist ideologies is their fervent violation of individual rights, in this case, rights to private property being violated or abolished. And again, the reasoning does not change anything. It's time to mention some socialist shitholes such as Venezuela, where there are food shortages and toilet paper shortages. North Korea, one of the most despicable countries in this planet. And let's not forget the Eastern Bloc. My question to you, does your lower intestine empty your skull by chance? It says that capitalism needs an authoritarian state to survive, when communism has literally ended up in failure in every single country. You loony leftists fail to comprehend these facts that every single communist country in this world has fallen, and today's communist/socialist countries are slowly on their way to capitalism, except North Korea. Merging the state with the market is socialism. It has always been socialist. Private property is a self-evident right of the individual based on action, not state power. And I am going to debunk the part where you say that healthcare was already nationalized in Germany. Well, don't you think that if Hitler was a capitalist like you say, don't you think he would have privatized it? Yes, but he kept it nationalized, and he nationalized the whole economy. And this next statement will debunk you and all other commies when they say that Nazism isn't socialism because it lacks equality. But socialism wants everybody to be equal, not by race or religion, but by class. Hitler believed no one was rich or poor, but German. I'd also like to add on to that part where you say that my documentary was quite laughable because it was made by right-wingers, but the documentary actually had testimonies, letters, and documents that actually prove it was true. So I guess I can't debunk that part because you're using your typical socialist argument that anything that makes my ideology look bad is fake, while anything that is pro my ideology is true. Another thing you fail to see is how under capitalism, the capitalists, the CEOs and all of them, they own the means of production, not the state. And under Nazi Germany and most other fascist countries, the state is the one that owns the means of production. That's not capitalism. It's supposed to be owned by private owners. And like, let's say for example, you used all those those wealthy German people who supported Nazism. Well, there were rich Nazis just like there are rich communists. For example, Michael Moore, Tim Robbins, Susan Sarandon, Sean Penn. So all wealthy people are automatically capitalists? I don't think so, because saying that capitalists supported Nazism is like saying that capitalists support communism. Both ideologies are anti-capitalist.
Hello, this is luismarrero899, and I am going to help Anti-Communist TV for his video on debunking Social Democrat. I'm going to show you this part right here, which I am going to debunk.
A bit aggressive there. I think his point was that Hitler was actually supported by real capitalists, not phony ones like Scotty M and yourself. Now let's look at the real capitalists who supported Hitler. Let us start with Emil Kurdoff, coal mining baron who loathed the left. In the 1920s, he even campaigned to abolish the 8-hour day, which is thankfully now entrenched in Western societies, thanks to the work of trade unions. Krupp was the wealthiest man in Germany, owning massive armaments factories and employing 123,000 people. Another supporter of Hitler.
Yeah, but the thing you don't like is that there were corporations that were backing the Soviet Union as well. Meet Fred C. Koch. He was the founder of the Winker Koch Engineer Company, which is a Texas Midway oil storage company. And in 1929 to 1932, Koch built 15 cracking units in the Soviet Union and many other elsewhere in Europe, the Middle East, and Asia. He also backed Soviet dictator Joseph Stalin. Another example is when the New York Times had funded Fidel Castro for his communist revolution and went as far as claiming that Castro was not a communist. Also, the majority of the money that Fidel got from the New York Times went to executions of innocent Cubans. And I will show you this clip to prove it.
Another Times correspondent, Herbert Matthews, also covered for collectivism. During the so-called Spanish Civil War in the late 1930s, communists throughout Spain brutally massacred more than 6,000 priests, friars, and nuns. Matthews' dispatches, however, depicted the communists as idealistic Democrats seeking to liberate Spain from tyranny. No mention was made of the communist atrocities. Later, when the Times assigned Matthews to report on Cuba, he crafted an image of an obscure revolutionary as a romantic and idealistic hero, supported by thousands of Cubans. Matthews' stories set the stage for a campaign to bring Fidel Castro to power. As other observers noted, Castro got his job through the New York Times. Meanwhile, Matthews reports assured Americans that Castro definitely was not a communist. After seizing power, Castro began eliminating all potential internal opposition. Firing squads operated day and night. Matthews' reaction to Castro's slaughtering was callous. Youth must sow its wild oats. Despite his blatantly pro-communist reporting, the Times kept Matthews on staff for over 45 years.
And the disgusting thing is, he starts bragging about all these capitalists who support Adolf Hitler, but ignore the capitalists that backed the Soviet Union, backed Joseph Stalin or Fidel Castro. And here's the other disgusting thing. This communist known as Social Democrat supported the American version of Adolf Hitler, which he is well known as Franklin D. Roosevelt, who had sent at least 110,000 to 12,000 Japanese Americans into concentration camps. I will provide you another video clip.
That stereotype of Asian Americans as the enemy was all too real for George Takei from his very youngest days growing up in Los Angeles.
I remember that morning, and in fact, I can never forget that morning. It was a terrifying morning. I was in the living room looking out the front window, and I saw two soldiers come marching up our driveway. And I saw at the end of their rifles shiny bayonets. They stomped up to our front door at our two-bedroom home on Garnet Street in Los Angeles and banged on the front door. It was terrifying. My father answered and we were ordered out of our home.
George Takei's family had committed no crime. Along with thousands of other law-abiding Japanese Americans, they were taken from their home in California in 1942 and forced to relocate to an internment camp. The reason was this. On December 7, 1941, Japan bombed the U.S. Navy base at Pearl Harbor. Overnight, America was at war with Japan, and the U.S. government became suspicious of anyone of Japanese heritage. As a group, these U.S. citizens were labeled by their government as enemy non-aliens.
What's a non-alien? That's a citizen. They couldn't even call us citizens then. We were enemy non-aliens. Why? Because of this. We were taken to the horse stables. And thinking back now, I can't imagine how degrading and humiliating it must have been for my parents to take their 3 children, one a baby, from a 2-bedroom home and told to sleep in that narrow, smelly horse stall. I remember the barbed wire fences and the sentry tower, the searchlight that followed me when I made the night runs from our barrack to the latrine. It was a racist act, pure and simple, and it was an unconstitutional act. I mean, you can't imprison people for their race, and that's what we were imprisoned for.
Now I'm going to show one of Rocky Mr. E's videos.
How can fascism best be described? Fascism is one of those words often thrown around by people that have no idea what it actually is. One reason is that it's a generic insult describing a dictatorship, and another reason is that Marxists or communists deliberately mischaracterize fascism for propaganda purposes, mainly by suggesting that it relies on capitalism to exist. What I aim to do with this video is provide a relatively brief but concise description of fascism so that people can gain a fundamental understanding of fascism that isn't mired by misconceptions. Fascists and communists have a lot in common, not least the fact that both ideologies like to co-opt language and movements for their own nefarious ends. Both ideologies rely on euphemisms and weasel words so that people aren't aware of what they're really supporting until it's too late. Therefore, the word fascist, like Marxist, communist, or Nazi, is rarely used by people that can be described by these words. This is because fascism has a terrible reputation historically, just like other authoritarian ideologies. Deception is therefore applied to fool people into believing that fascists are just another run-of-the-mill group of people fighting for certain rights. Many ideologies use this strategy, like cultural Marxists and communists. But what fascist and communist movements have in common is that they are ultimately socialist, and this is the common linchpin for both. To understand why, it's important to have a grasp on what socialism is. Socialism is really another word for collectivism, which is by far the most accurate word to describe this ideology. Socialists come in a variety of forms, but all believe that civilization should be centrally planned by an authority that has absolute power. Semantics are often employed to confuse people into thinking that how this authority operates truly matters. The reason why it doesn't matter is because any socialist system can only be enacted by being authoritarian, and as long as any system in place has absolute control over individual freedom, then it can accurately be described as a form of socialism, collectivism, or what some call statism. Some socialist ideologies merge religion with the state to create theocracy, and others are nihilistic or secular ideologies that reject religion altogether. So this in itself shows the variety and scope that can be found under socialism and collectivism. Whatever form socialism takes is secondary to the fact that all socialist ideologies believe individuals have little to no rights unless granted by a central authority, and that the individual exists to serve the collective above all. Having made a few clarifications regarding the nature of socialism and collectivism, it should now be easier to understand what fascism is. Fascism is a collectivist ideology with strong historical roots in socialism, and particularly socialist workers' parties. The most obvious example is the National Socialist German Workers' Party, and like all fascist ideologies, can be described as National Socialism. This is distinctive from international socialist ideologies such as communism, and this is the key to understanding how communists have managed to fool people into thinking that fascism is a form of capitalism. To have a true understanding of what fascism is, it's therefore a good idea to explain it in economic and social terms. Economic fascism is often called corporatism, which is best described as the merging of state and corporate power. Some call this corporate fascism, cronyism, or crony capitalism. Under this economic system, the central authority takes equitable ownership of the means of production through taxation and regulation. While the state does not have the legal title over the means of production, like in economic communism, the state still controls the means of production through policies that punish and reward certain economic activity. Under economic fascism, corporations controlling property and the means of production do so at the behest of an authority that centrally plans and dictates economic policy. As a reward, the state protects corporations from failure by socializing losses while still allowing for the privatization of profits for certain individuals that cooperate with central authority. The state and corporations therefore work as a group or collectively, in accordance with a central plan, which is why corporatism is a form of collectivism. It's completely false to suggest that corporatism has anything to do with capitalism. Under capitalism, no protectionism exists, and therefore both profits and losses are passed on to individuals, instead of the state stepping in to socialise losses, but still allowing individuals to amass profits. The 2008 banker bailouts and the bailout of GM Motors is an example of what happens when corporate fascism ensues, though leftist talking heads like Noam Chomsky and Michael Moore always mislead the public into believing this is something to do with capitalism. It's essential that people understand that under capitalism, both profits and losses are absorbed by private individuals. Therefore, bailouts do not exist under capitalism, but they most certainly do under economic fascism. Social fascism relies on identity politics to convince people to rally to a particular cause. While communists often focus on social class, fascists concentrate on race. Fascists will often scapegoat certain races and use this as a foundation to bind another race of people together. Traditionally, fascism has also been a movement that focuses on what leftists often call the bourgeoisie. As such, you could call fascism socialism for the educated and skilled classes of society, or what some call the middle classes. Communism, on the other hand, is socialism for the working classes, but has been adapted over time to incorporate other groups based on race, sex, and sexuality. This is often called cultural Marxism, which is the translation of economic Marxism to cultural terms. Some say that fascism cannot be socialist because it's a hierarchical system, while international socialist ideologies like anarcho-syndicalism and communism are egalitarian. While it's true that fascists are more inclined to base their values on a strong hierarchical structure, communism and its international socialist variants are very different when comparing theory to practice. The truth is that international socialist ideologies all rely on a political class that centrally plans all economic and social life, and many will always try to gloss over this fact. The few international socialist ideologies that do try to implement some form of democracy are still very restrictive, especially with individual property rights, and inevitably have some sort of head authority that has the final say on any decisions that are made. These distinctions are very important because in the end, all socialist ideologies are very authoritarian and use the cover of egalitarianism or a common purpose to fool people. Fascism, like all forms of socialism, cannot exist without demagoguery at its core. Fascists take advantage of economic and social issues that are often based on legitimate concerns and twist them through exaggeration and distortion. Once people are adequately riled up, this allows groupthink to be fomented and for victim mentality and othering to be established. All socialist ideologies rely on this method, and it's a critical part of identity politics. People will then be brainwashed into accepting naive solutions that open the floodgates for greater centralization, which is exactly what the authoritarians pulling the strings behind the scenes want. But by the time people realize that what they're advocating is often the opposite of what they believe they're getting, it's too late to solve the problem without a great deal of struggle and conflict. While fascists, communists, and socialists all differ in some shape or form, they're all collectivists and therefore left-wing. None of these ideologies have anything whatsoever to do with right-wing individualism and capitalism. Fascism and communism often feed off one another. Sometimes they act as enemies, but when push comes to shove, they progress towards totalitarianism. This is Rocking MrE, over and out.
And that is it for today. Remember, smash the left.